At age 53, Dwayne Johnson stands in a position that very few Americans could ever reach in a lifetime. He is one of the highest-grossing movie stars in Hollywood history, with global box office totals exceeding tens of billions of dollars. He is the cornerstone face of major entertainment franchises like Fast and Furious, Jumanji, Moana, and San Andreas, while also serving as a guaranteed box office draw for large-scale action projects. From a professional wrestler, he rose to become a pop culture icon, topping the Forbes list of the world's highest-paid actors for many years in a row. He built his own business empire with 7 Bucks Productions, getting involved in running and producing a wide range of film and television projects, while also achieving massive success in commercial ventures with sports, beverage, and entertainment brands. On social media, he has one of the largest followings on the planet, directly influencing hundreds of millions of people. In the world of sports entertainment, he was a multiple-time WWE champion, inducted into the Hall of Fame, and remains one of the most magnetic figures in the history of professional wrestling. To the American public, Dwayne Johnson embodies the modern American dream, rising from nothing, conquering every peak, always appearing strong, positive, and flawless. But behind that towering pile of achievements lies another story, one far quieter and much heavier. Few people ask what he had to carry to get there, and few notice that every accomplishment was built not just with talent and discipline, but also with years of silent endurance. Before becoming an unshakable icon, Dwayne Johnson was a child who grew up in instability, a young man who watched his mother sink into depression, an athlete who lost his NFL dream entirely, and a person who once fell into depression himself when he no longer knew who he was. His willpower was not born from glory. It was forged in the fear of losing everything, in the feeling that he was never allowed to be weak, in the pressure to carry both his family and the world's expectations. That very pain forced him to keep moving forward when others were allowed to stop, forced him to smile when he was already drained inside, forced him to be the pillar even when he himself needed support. And that is why this story is not only about what Dwayne Johnson achieved, but about how much he endured in order not to collapse. Because some people are not strong because they want to be, but because they never had any other choice. If you want to keep following the story behind Dwayne Johnson's spotlight, the place where success was paid for with years of silent suffering, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Dwayne Johnson's childhood did not begin with the warm memories people usually associate with the word family. Instead, it started with constant moving, makeshift homes, silent packing sessions, and the ever-present feeling of having to be ready to leave at any moment. Young Dwayne grew up in a world where stability was a luxury, where rent came due before hope could even take shape, where adult conversations weren't about future plans, but about how to make it through the next week. There were evenings when he lay in a bed he wasn't sure would still be his tomorrow, listening to his mother's voice fade in the kitchen, hearing the wind slip through the door cracks, and wondering whether he'd wake up in that same room the next morning or somewhere completely unfamiliar. That childhood taught Dwayne a lesson far too early. Never assume anything is permanent. While other kids learned to dream, he learned to observe. While other kids heard cars on the street with indifference, Dwayne heard them with the full alertness of a child terrified of losing shelter. A car pulling up outside wasn't just a sound. It was an alarm, a signal to brace himself, to prepare for losing one more thing. His body memorized that sound as a survival reflex, and that reflex never went away, even after he grew up, became famous, and got rich. The fear of losing everything sank deep into him, not through big dramatic events told later, but through small, repeated details that became the background. Meals that had to be shared, money counted and recounted, promises from adults that weren't always kept, not because they were bad people, but because they were desperate too. In that world, Dwayne had no privilege to be weak or complain, because he quickly understood that his own fears were a luxury compared to the adult's worries. He learned to stay quiet, to not ask for things, to become emotionally easy to care for, because any extra burden could be the final straw for a family already on the edge. The deprivation wasn't just about money. It was about lacking a sense of safety, lacking a solid emotional anchor for a child to grow up normally. Dwayne's childhood had no memories recounted with smiles, no cozy evenings around a full dinner table, only prolonged vigilance, like a string constantly taut, never allowed to slacken. He grew up feeling that if he wasn't careful, if he let his guard down, if he relied too much on anyone, everything would collapse. And from that, a quiet belief took root. Safety isn't given. It's something you have to create and hold on to yourself at any cost. It was in that atmosphere of missing reassurance that Dwayne learned to observe the world rather than trust it, to prepare for loss, before loss even happened, to carry fear as part of his instincts. That childhood gave him no gentleness to look back on fondly, but it left a deep scar, turning him into the man who later could never fully relax, never fully believe he had reached a truly safe place. It was a childhood without warm memories, only extended vigilance through the years, and that very vigilance followed Dwayne Johnson, his whole life becoming fuel for his willpower, but also the quiet source of exhaustion no one else could see. After years of growing up in vigilance and insecurity, the real event that etched fear deep into Dwayne Johnson's core came on a day he would never forget. The day the one person who could shelter him suddenly became more fragile than anyone else. Ata Johnson, the mother who had strained to be the family's rock through years of repeated crises, began slipping deeply into severe depression, a condition that, at the time, no one in the family had the language to name. They only felt it through prolonged silences, vacant eyes, and moments when she seemed to disappear even while standing right in front of her son. Dwayne was still too young then to understand what depression really was, too immature to distinguish between temporary sadness and the despair eating away at someone's mind, but he could feel very clearly that something had broken inside the woman he trusted most. Then came the defining moment, one Dwayne later admitted, completely changed how he saw the world and himself. In utter desperation, his mother tried to end her life right in front of her son. No cinematic drama, no long speeches, just a child frozen in shock, heart pounding wildly, mind blank, unable to comprehend why the person who had guided him through so many moves and anxious nights now wanted to leave him in that way. In that moment, Dwayne wasn't a strong boy or a hero, he was just a terrified, helpless child facing an adult world he wasn't prepared for. He couldn't understand why love and effort still weren't enough to keep someone here, why an adult's pain could grow so huge it swallowed even the responsibility of being a mother, why his own existence apparently wasn't enough to hold on to the one person he thought would never leave. That lack of understanding was the most painful part, because it forced Dwayne to confront a harsh truth for the first time. There are pains a child cannot fail, battles that love isn't strong enough to win. After that event, Dwayne's world no longer divided neatly into safe and dangerous. It became a place where anything could collapse without warning, even the things that seemed most sacred and enduring. From that second onward, in his young mind, a silent vow formed, one never spoken, but powerful enough to shape his entire life. He would never be a burden to anyone, never be the reason someone else sank deeper into despair, never let anyone carry extra worry because of him. That vow didn't come from nobility. It came from the extreme terror of a child who had watched his mother want to disappear, a fear that if he was weak, if he asked for too much, if he wasn't strong enough, others wouldn't be able to bear it. But from that same vow, another door quietly closed. Dwayne no longer allowed himself the right to be weak, to complain, to lean on anyone, because in his mind, weakness meant hurting others, meant dragging someone else down into the abyss he'd already witnessed. He began carrying a responsibility no one had assigned him, the responsibility to be the strongest person in any room, not for admiration, but to make sure no one had to worry about him, no one had to fear because of him, so he would never cause another tragedy. Over the years, that responsibility grew along with his body, embedding itself into how Dwayne faced life, making him used to shielding others while never knowing how to let anyone shield him. The incident with his mother didn't just leave pain, it restructured his entire inner world, turning childhood vigilance into a harsh form of emotional discipline where he forbade himself weakness, forbade himself stopping, forbade himself saying he wasn't okay. From then on, whenever he faced failure, pressure, or the fear of losing everything, Dwayne didn't run, didn't share. He chose to brace himself, push forward, and endure in silence. Deep down, the image remained, a child once standing helpless before his mother's pain, quietly telling himself he had to be stronger than this world, not to conquer it, but so no one else would ever collapse because of him again. After the incident with his mother, when Dwayne Johnson's inner world was forced to mature early in fear and responsibility, his relationship with his father emerged as another void, quiet, but stretching across many years, one that was never filled. His father, Rocky Johnson, was a legend in the wrestling world, a man who carried fame, toughness, and the pride of a generation that wasn't used to talking about emotions. He was always there in a formal sense, in name, in legacy, but never truly present as a spiritual place Dwayne could return to. Growing up in the shadow of a famous father, Dwayne felt both pride and an invisible pressure, no one named, the pressure to be worthy, to be strong, to endure, to never be allowed to complain. In that house, there were no long talks about feelings, no questions like, "Are you okay, son?" Only silent lessons passed on through attitude, through looks, through the way an older man faced life. Rocky Johnson didn't teach his son how to share fear, because he himself had never been taught that. He only taught by example that a man endures, swallows everything inside, and keeps moving forward. For Dwayne, that was both a guiding principle and a wall. He learned discipline. He learned not to quit. But he didn't learn how to speak up when he was hurting, when he was tired, when he needed someone to listen. Father and son existed in the same space, shared the same blood, but spoke different languages, neither wrong, but neither understood the other. There were long silences between them, not from hatred, but from not knowing where to start, not knowing what words to use to reach each other without wounding both egos. Dwayne grew up feeling he always had to prove something to that father, even though no clear demand was ever spoken, and that very vagueness was the heaviest burden. He never knew if he was enough, never knew if he was accepted, because in their world, recognition wasn't shown through words, it was shown by continuing to stand firm. When Dwayne began to stumble, to fail, to become confused about himself, he didn't turn to his father to open up, not because he didn't love him, but because he'd never been taught that was an option. Their relationship was like a house without doors, only walls and a roof enough to shield from outside rain and sun, but not warm enough to truly be called home in the fullest sense. For many years, Dwayne carried the feeling that he was a son, standing on the edge of his father's legacy, trying to reach it, but never sure if he was truly seen. The most painful part wasn't arguments or public conflicts. It was the absence of the small moments a child needs to feel safe. A hug for no reason, an affirmation without conditions, a presence not tied to achievements. As he grew older, Dwayne became a man who could stand in front of tens of thousands, deliver powerful speeches, but still felt awkward in front of his own father because between them lay a distance built from decades of silence. And that very distance taught Dwayne early on that some relationships never truly become home, not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of language to give each other safety. This didn't make him turn his back on his father, nor did it turn into resentment. It quietly became part of his psychological structure. He learned to father himself, to set his own standards, to push himself, to carry every pressure without waiting for outside validation. But deep down, there remained an unnamed longing, the longing for a place where he didn't have to be strong, didn't have to prove anything, didn't have to endure in silence. The relationship with his father, therefore, wasn't just a story between two men. It was the foundation explaining why Dwayne Johnson later always chose the role of pillar, always stood at the front, taking the hits, but took a very long time to learn how to allow himself to be vulnerable in front of the people he loved. Because from very early on, he had grown used to living in a relationship that never truly felt like home. After the long silences in his relationship with his father, Dwayne Johnson stepped into football as if it were the last remaining escape, not just to play a sport, but to find an identity clear enough to help him exist in a world that had always felt unsteady beneath his feet. Football for Dwayne wasn't simply passion or a career choice. It was a silent promise that if he was strong enough, good enough, disciplined enough, he would finally have a place no one could take away. In a childhood lacking security, a family full of pressure, and relationships that didn't know how to express love, the field became the only place where everything had rules, order, clear standards for winning and losing. Dwayne poured his entire identity into the NFL because he believed that if he could become a professional football player, all questions about his worth, his deservingness, whether he was enough, would automatically be answered. He trained with an intensity few could endure, pushing his body past limits not to impress, but because he didn't allow himself a plan B. In his mind back then, football wasn't just the only path, it was the path to survival. Every practice, every game, every hit carried the fear that if he slowed down, if he weakened, everything would collapse as it had in the past. The NFL, in Dwayne's imagination, was the door to stability, to recognition, to a life where he no longer had to listen for every sound outside the door, no longer had to brace himself to shield others, no longer had to prove anything to anyone. But when that dream hit reality, it didn't shatter in dramatic fashion or a heroic moment. It died coldly and cruelly in silence. Dwayne was cut from the roster cleanly, with no long explanations, no conversation long enough to close out years of sacrifice, just a short notice that he wasn't in the plans. No fanfare, no farewell ceremony, no one stepping up to say his efforts were respected. The NFL dream died quietly, as if it had never existed, leaving a void Dwayne didn't know how to fill. For the first time in his life, he faced a brutal truth with no emotional cushion. Effort doesn't guarantee anything. He had done everything asked of him and more, but it still wasn't enough. And there was no clear reason to hold on to, no one to blame, no enemy to confront. The most painful part wasn't losing the chance to play, it was losing the identity he'd bet his entire self on. When the NFL closed that door, it didn't just take a potential career. It took the answer to who he was, leaving him standing alone before himself. Dwayne became a young man with no job, no identity, no direction, and for the first time, he felt completely empty. No more field to run to for escape, no more training schedule to cling to, no goal clear enough to make him wake up each morning, feeling he had a reason to exist. He was forced to face the deepest fear that had followed him since childhood, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, he could still be left behind with no one noticing. This failure wasn't witnessed by crowds, wasn't recorded by media, but it carved deeper into his inner world than any public setback that came later, because it shattered the simple belief he'd once gripped like a lifeline, that if he worked hard enough, the world would fairly reward him. From that moment, Dwayne began to understand that life doesn't run on an effort-reward logic, and that understanding both broke him and quietly reshaped his willpower in a harsher way. He no longer believed he would be saved by fairness, no longer believed the system would reach out to catch those who tried, and because of that, he learned not to wait for guarantees from anyone or anything. The NFL dream dying unnoticed taught him the first adult lesson about the world, that some losses come without comfort, some endings without explanation, and some pain you have to carry alone because no one sees it as worth stopping for. And it was from those quiet ashes that Dwayne Johnson stepped off the field with a different mindset, no longer naive, no longer believing in the unspoken promise of effort, carrying a bitter clarity that would follow him for the rest of his life, forcing him to become tougher, more stubborn, and ready to shoulder more than a man his age should have had to bear. When the NFL door closed in silence, Dwayne Johnson came home not as a loud failure, but as a quiet shadow carrying his full emptiness. In his pocket at that time, he had exactly $7, a number so small it wasn't even a beginning, but big enough to become a haunting memory for years to come. No career, no plan, no identity. Dwayne stood in front of the mirror and saw a young man who had bet everything on a dream that had just died without anyone noticing. The mirror didn't reflect muscles or potential. It reflected a raw question. If football is gone, then who am I? In that moment, every structure that had once helped him survive collapsed at once. No more training schedule to cling to. No more goal to push himself toward. No more story to tell himself that things would be okay. He woke up each morning not knowing where he was going, and the scariest thing wasn't the lack of money, it was the lack of a reason to get out of bed. Dwayne had grown used to enduring, used to silence, but he'd never grown used to feeling useless. He looked in the mirror and saw a man who had failed in the most bitter way, a failure no one witnessed, no one named, no one comforted, no coach to explain, no teammates to share with, no crowd to boo or cheer, only him, and the question repeating in his head, day after day, what if I'm not good at anything? That question wasn't loud. It didn't make him collapse right away. It crept in, wore him down, made every thought feel heavy. He began doubting himself, doubting the years that had passed, doubting even the self-soothing words that had once helped him survive an unstable childhood. If effort didn't guarantee anything, if discipline wasn't enough to keep a dream alive, then what was left, besides a strong body and a tired will? This was the deepest bottom no one knew about, because there were no outward signs for the world to see that a person was crumbling from the inside. Dwayne still stood tall, still talked normally, still tried to hold calm, but every night, when the room fell quiet, the emptiness rose up, heavy enough to make breathing hard. What he feared most wasn't poverty, he'd known that since childhood, but that he no longer had value worth pursuing any path. The silence of this period wasn't like the vigilance of childhood or the pressure of his playing years. It was a terrifying stillness, where there was no sound to warn, no specific danger to fight, only an endless, undefined void. Dwayne began to understand that some moments in life aren't marked by big tragedies, have no dramatic event to make others pause and care, but still have the deepest destructive power, because they force you to face the question of your own existence's worth. With $7 in his pocket and no clear plan ahead, he stood at a crossroads with no signs, no guide, no promise that going forward would lead anywhere. This was the time Dwayne Johnson nearly vanished from every success story, a gap people often skip when telling his journey. But that very gap was the foundation for everything that came after. Because at the deepest bottom, with nothing left to hold on to, he was forced to face the truth that if he wanted to keep living, he would have to create his own reason, rebuild his identity from zero, and accept the possibility that he could fail many more times. No one knew that then. No one patted his shoulder or encouraged him, and it was the absolute loneliness of that period that forged a different kind of willpower in Dwayne. Not the willpower of someone sure he would win, but the willpower of someone with nothing left to lose, who still chose to stand up, step by step, in silence. From the deepest bottom, with $7 in his pocket and an empty identity, Dwayne Johnson stepped into wrestling not with belief, but with the disciplined desperation of someone with no way back. He chose WWE not out of pure passion, but because it was the only door still open for a strong body and a name carrying heavy legacy. But right from the first steps, what awaited him wasn't opportunity, it was thick doubt. In many people's eyes, he was just the son of a son, a face favored because of his last name, not because of ability. That legacy, instead of protecting him, turned into a target. The audience didn't grant him patience. They booed, cursed, rejected him the moment he stepped onto the ring. Those boos weren't just aimed at the character on the mat. They were aimed straight at the person behind it, at a young man who had just lost his NFL dream and had nothing left to prove except the fear of failing again. Dwayne quickly realized that in wrestling, if the crowd doesn't believe in you, the system won't keep you either. Every time he stepped up was a brutal public vote, and he kept losing. There were nights he left the ring to prolonged boos, feeling pushed out even while standing under the lights. That coldness wasn't like the NFL failure, because this time it was public, loud, and repeated to the point of erosion. Dwayne was nearly phased out of the system not by a decisive decision, but by accumulated indifference, the kind that makes you understand that if you don't change, you'll disappear, and no one will care. And it was at that point that wrestling revealed its true nature to Dwayne. This wasn't salvation. It was the cruelest test he'd ever faced. To survive, he was forced to do something against every remaining instinct, dismantle his old image himself. He learned to listen to the crowd, not to be loved, but to know what they hated. He accepted being hated on purpose, accepted becoming the thing they wanted to throw stones at, as long as they didn't turn their backs. Every line, every gesture, every pause on the mat was sharpened not to express himself, but to control the reaction of tens of thousands. It was a painful process of self-dissection, where Dwayne had to sacrifice sincerity to learn the technique of survival. He no longer asked if he liked it. He asked if it would keep him there. Wrestling taught him a bitter lesson. If you want to survive, you have to be ready to become the version the crowd accepts, even if that version pulls you away from yourself. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a long chain of nights of trial and error, humiliation, boos, and getting back up again. Sometimes Dwayne wondered if he was giving up too much, if pleasing the crowd by bending himself would turn him into someone he no longer recognized. But the memory of $7 in his pocket and the question, "What if I'm not good at anything?" always pulled him back to reality. He had no privilege to choose comfort. Wrestling, in those years, didn't give him a sense of belonging. It only gave him a thin chance to prove he was tough enough not to be eliminated. Every time he was mocked before being hated, he learned one more thing about human nature and the nature of attention. Indifference is the final sentence. So he accepted being hated. He turned boos into energy, mockery into fuel, and gradually learned to own the space with words, rhythm, confidence, built from scars. But the cost was inner erosion. The better he performed the role on the mat, the deeper he had to bury the real person behind it. Wrestling didn't embrace him. It forced him to rebirth according to its rules. And that very cruelty sharpened a rare ability in Dwayne Johnson, the ability to stand firm against collective rejection, the ability to endure public hatred without collapsing. That wasn't victory, it was survival. Not salvation, but passing a test where one slip would make him vanish from the story before it even began. When Dwayne Johnson finally found the formula that made the crowd stop turning away, the name The Rock was born not as a radiant moment of birth, but as a silent survival agreement. The Rock's success came so fast, it was overwhelming. Roaring cheers, lights, lines that became iconic, a presence that dominated every space he entered. The crowd that once booed now chanted in unison. The system that once doubted now trusted him as an indispensable pillar. But at the same time, Dwayne Johnson, the man who carried childhood vigilance, family trauma, the quiet death of the NFL dream, and empty nights, began to fade behind the character. The Rock's success demanded absolute consistency. The smile had to hit the right beat. The lines had to be sharp. The energy always at peak. No slips, no fatigue. The laughter became a perfect protective shell, hiding the simmering fear that if he ever stopped performing one day, the crowd would turn away again. Every round of applause, instead of filling him, added another layer of loneliness, because it wasn't for the person behind, but for the image in front. It honored the character, not the human. Dwayne learned to command the room with humor and confidence, but the price was constantly hiding the confusion about whether he still existed without that role. In The Rock's world, every emotion had to be controlled. Weakness was seen as a flaw, hesitation as a crack, silence as losing edge. And so Dwayne kept bracing himself because he'd learned too well from the years before. Indifference is the harshest sentence. Success brought money, power, recognition, but it also built a sophisticated golden cage where he was loved as long as he didn't change. He won, but that win came with an unspoken condition: never let the real person show. Those nights backstage, when the cheers had faded, Dwayne faced exhaustion with nowhere to release it, because he didn't know who to share it with. The Rock wasn't allowed to be tired, and Dwayne was too used to denying himself the right to be weak. The separation between character and person grew clearer, like two parallel lines that never met. One side an unbeatable icon, the other a man carrying the fear of losing everything from childhood. Every time he stepped onto the mat, he felt the power of being loved, but also understood that love was conditional, and the condition was that he had to keep playing the role fully. The Rock gave him everything the system could offer, but gradually took away the moments he could be himself, could be silent without judgment, could be tired without being seen as weak. In the blinding lights, Dwayne Johnson began to disappear in a way no one noticed, because no one was looking for him. They were looking for The Rock. And that very paradox was the deepest pain of this phase. He had won the game, but the win required him to bury the real person alive to preserve the character. Every round of applause rang like a reminder that he was being seen, but not in the way he craved. It confirmed success, but didn't soothe the growing loneliness. He stood at the center of all attention, yet learned to be alone in his own mind, because if The Rock stopped smiling, if The Rock stopped being strong, then who would stay? And so Dwayne kept walking, kept performing, kept winning, carrying a bitter truth only he knew. He had found a way to survive, but not yet a way to be himself. When the wrestling lights started feeling familiar enough to lose their novelty, Dwayne Johnson turned his gaze to Hollywood as another possibility for survival, not out of ambition to change his life, but because he understood deeply one thing: if you stand still in one place, the world will soon forget you. The door to film truly opened in front of him, but it didn't open with welcome. It opened with scrutiny and doubt. Hollywood didn't believe in him. In the eyes of many directors and producers, he was just a famous wrestler, a muscular body that could deliver lines, a name to use in short-term projects and replace when needed. The first roles he got were superficial, written not to explore who he was, but to fill an existing mold. The big man with little inner life, there to fight and disappear. He was boxed into roles that didn't demand depth, didn't allow mistakes, and didn't allow growth. Every time he appeared on the big screen, he faced the repeated question from critics and audiences alike: was he really an actor, or just a wrestling byproduct brought to film for convenience? Meanwhile, the wrestling world began looking at him differently. To them, Dwayne was no longer one who stayed, he was the one who branched off. Whispers appeared, then grew clearer. He was betraying his roots, betraying those who lifted him to the top, betraying a community that measured value by loyalty. Wrestling no longer opened its arms as before. He became the man in between, no longer fully belonging to either side. It was in this phase that Dwayne was stuck between two worlds, and both refused to claim him as their own. Hollywood saw him as temporary, something to use when they needed a familiar face, then ready to replace when tastes shifted. Wrestling saw him as the one who left, an icon who chose another light. There was no place that truly felt like home. Every step he took carried the feeling of not being invited to stay, only permitted to stand temporarily in the doorway, waiting to see if he was valuable enough to step further. Dwayne understood that if he failed in film, the door back to wrestling wouldn't stay as open as before. But if he didn't try, he'd be forever boxed in an image he was starting to feel suffocated by. That pressure didn't explode into tragedy. It quietly gnawed, making every choice carry the risk of losing everything. He had to keep proving he deserved to stay in Hollywood, while also enduring the cold stares from the place that once launched him. There was no romance in this phase, only tense workdays, script readings filled with fear of repeating himself, and nights wondering if he was chasing an illusion. Dwayne had no privilege to fail publicly, because he knew one big slip could close both doors at once. He was no longer the $7 kid no one noticed, but he'd never felt truly accepted either. Instead, he became someone always in a defensive stance, always proving his worth with every appearance. The loneliness of this phase was different from what he'd experienced before. It didn't come from poverty or material lack, but from not belonging anywhere. He had a name, lights, opportunities, but lacked a place where he could plant his feet without explaining who he was. Hollywood opened the door but didn't invite him to stay. Wrestling still remembered him, but no longer saw him as the center. And in that suspended space, Dwayne Johnson was forced to learn how to stand firm without full acceptance from any world, carrying the feeling that every passing day was a test where one misstep could drop him back into the anonymity he'd once feared more than anything. When the film wheel finally started rolling in the right direction, Dwayne Johnson entered a phase that, on the surface, looked like the deserved reward for all those years of feeling adrift before. Fast and Furious, Jumanji, blockbuster franchises exploding at the box office, numbers that shattered every doubt, and a new position in Hollywood that very few people could ever reach. Success came in waves, as if making up for the time he was once seen as temporary, as a backup choice. But it was from that very moment that another pressure began to form, the pressure of not being allowed to fall. If before he could still fail in silence, now every project carried the scrutinizing eyes of an entire industry that had bet on his image. Each movie was no longer just a job. It became a verdict on his reputation, where one box office number lower than expected was enough to reignite the old doubt that he was just a fleeting phenomenon. Dwayne understood the rules of the game clearly. When you're seen as a box office guarantee, you're not allowed to get tired, not allowed to experiment and fail, not allowed to appear weaker than the image the audience has grown used to. The pressure to keep being the strongest guy in the room, therefore, didn't just exist on screen. It seeped into every decision off-screen, from packed shooting schedules to the way he appeared in public. Every time he stepped into the lights, he had to bring steady energy, unshakable confidence, and a smile wide enough to hide any cracks. Success, which had once been the goal to free him from anonymity, now began to erode his inner life in the most subtle way. It turned choices into obligations, turned drive into the fear of falling behind. Dwayne no longer asked if he wanted to take on a project. He asked if he could refuse without shaking the hard-earned position he'd built. Every contract he signed added an unspoken commitment that he would continue to be the strong version the world expected, no matter the mental cost. That pressure didn't explode into a clear crisis. It accumulated day after day, in jammed schedules, in back-to-back flights, in having to always show up as the pillar for both the crew and the brand. Dwayne began to feel the contradiction clearly. He had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of in terms of recognition, but he had less and less time to ask himself how he was actually feeling. Each successful project reinforced the expectation that he would keep winning, and that expectation, even wrapped in praise, carried the weight of an invisible yoke. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. One big enough slip could make the doors that had opened so wide slam shut faster than they had opened. Billion-dollar success, therefore, didn't bring absolute security. On the contrary, it maintained a state of high alert, where Dwayne always had to stay ahead of the fear of being replaced. He still smiled, still inspired, still stood as the symbol of strength, but deep inside, exhaustion began to linger like a persistent shadow. Quiet moments became rare, and when they came, they were often filled with the question of how much longer he could keep this pace. Success, in this phase, was no longer a destination. It became a wheel that didn't allow stopping, because stopping meant admitting you were no longer untouchable. And while the world saw a Dwayne Johnson at his peak, strong and busy, inside he began to feel clearly the price of always having to stand firm. A compressed inner life, where every emotion had to line up behind the responsibility of maintaining the image, and where not being allowed to fall became the biggest pressure of success. When billion-dollar success became the constant rhythm of life, the things that didn't show up on box office charts began to crack in silence. And Dwayne Johnson gradually realized that the price of always being prioritized in his career was prolonged absence in his private life. His first marriage broke down not through dramatic events or loud scandals, but through accumulated exhaustion over the years, through postponed promises, through evenings where one person waited while the other was still chasing an endless schedule. Dwayne didn't intentionally abandon his family. He was just used to putting work above everything else, because that was how he'd learned to survive, to keep himself and those around him safe. But that priority, when it stretched on too long, gradually became absence. He was there for the big moments, the important occasions, but missing from the small times that make up shared life. Everyday meals, aimless conversations, moments of just being together without needing to be strong or successful. His career kept soaring, but family life quietly slipped off track. And by the time Dwayne realized it, the gap was too wide to fill with just an apology. What hurt him most wasn't the breakup itself, but the moment he looked back and recognized a hauntingly familiar image. He was becoming the man he'd feared as a child, the one who was always there formally but emotionally distant, who put responsibility and work above spiritual presence. He'd once sworn he would never repeat the cycles that had hurt him, yet now he was reenacting them in a different, more subtle, harder-to-spot way. This realization didn't come as a shock, but as a slow, painful awakening when he understood that what he called sacrifice for his family was sometimes exactly why the family felt left behind. Dwayne began facing a new fear, deeper than the fear of career failure, the fear that he could succeed with the whole world but fail with the people closest to him. That terrifying loop took shape clearly, a man straining to be the pillar, believing he was protecting those he loved, while unintentionally creating distance that made them feel alone. He realized that physical strength and fame didn't help him answer the simplest questions of family life, didn't help him be fully present when the lights and applause were gone. In the rare quiet moments, Dwayne began to question whether absolute priority on career was really the only way to stay safe, or if it was just a habit formed from the past, fear of losing everything. The breakdown of his first marriage wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was a mirror, reflecting a path he'd gone too far down without looking back. It forced him to confront the possibility that if he kept living on that inertia, He could repeat the same story multiple times with different people, each time leaving scars that were hard to heal. There was no one to blame in this tragedy. No clear villain, no single wrong decision, just a chain of reasonable choices at each moment, adding up to an undeniable distance. Dwayne began to understand that success didn't exempt him from the consequences of absence, and that always being prioritized in career didn't automatically make him the partner or father he wanted to be. The pain of this phase wasn't in losing a relationship, it was in realizing he was walking a path so familiar it was terrifying. A path he'd sworn never to step on again. And that very realization, even if it came late, planted the seed for a quiet change ahead. Because for the first time in many years, Dwayne Johnson was forced to stop and ask not what else he would achieve, but how much more he would lose if he kept prioritizing everything over his private life. After the private breakup, with no one to blame, Dwayne Johnson entered the most dangerous phase of his life in a way no one saw and no one was prepared to recognize. There was no accident to sound the alarm, no illness to diagnose, no dramatic moment big enough to make the world pause. Just a quiet, brutal truth. His spirit had completely run dry. Everything still ran smoothly on the surface. Films kept shooting, contracts kept getting signed, schedules stayed packed, smiles appeared on cue. But inside, a void opened wider and wider, swallowing the reasons that once made him keep going. Dwayne realized he was living on the inertia of success, on the habit of bracing himself that had been forged since childhood, since the years of vigilance for cars outside the door, since the vow never to become a burden to anyone. But that inertia, when no longer fed by meaning, became the thing dragging him forward without letting him stop to breathe. He began to fear himself not because of weakness, but because of the terrifying numbness when things that once moved him now felt like mere obligations. Mornings, waking up to an endless to-do list, no longer brought a sense of purpose. They just reminded him he had to keep going, even if he didn't know why anymore. In the rare moments without noise, he faced the question hovering like a shadow. If one day he stopped, if he was no longer the strongest in the room, no longer the tireless pillar, what would he have left? That question didn't demand an immediate answer. It quietly eroded the confidence built from achievements, making every praise feel distant, every victory feel empty. Dwayne began to realize he'd gone too long without allowing himself weakness, to the point he no longer knew how to recognize exhaustion when it arrived. He only knew to keep pushing, keep overcoming, as if rest was a form of failure. This burnout didn't show through tears or public collapse. It showed through feeling detached from himself, through standing in a room full of people, yet feeling alone, through completing every responsibility, but feeling no joy when it ended. He feared that if he admitted the depletion, the entire structure he'd built to protect himself and those around him would collapse. That fear kept him silent, kept him playing the role of the tireless one, while inside his life energy had drained to an alarming level. This was the tragic climax of the story, not because it was loud, but because it was invisible, not because it was sudden, but because it stretched on so long it became normal. Dwayne understood he was at a dangerous point, not the edge of an accident, but the edge of losing himself. The moment he asked himself, "If I stop, who am I?" It wasn't a complaint. It was the sign of someone who'd lived too long, meeting others' expectations to the point of forgetting how to listen to his own needs. He looked back at the journey and saw a chain of timely stand-ups, times he didn't allow himself to fall, and realized that very ability, the ability not to fall, was now threatening him the most. Because if he didn't allow himself to stop, he would keep going until there was nothing left to carry except emptiness. In silence, without lights, without an audience, Dwayne faced the hard truth. His strength had always come from enduring, but enduring couldn't be a forever life strategy. No one around saw this exhaustion, because it didn't fit the image he'd nurtured. And because of that, he felt even more alone carrying it by himself. This wasn't the moment he collapsed. It was the moment he stood at the deepest mental crossroads. Either keep running on inertia until nothing could be salvaged, or learn to accept that stopping didn't mean disappearing. The tragedy of this phase lay in the fact that no one knew to intervene. No one asked to get an answer, and there was no outward sign clear enough to raise the alarm. Just one man at the peak of success, quietly facing his greatest fear. The fear that if he was no longer strong, the world would have no place for him, and that after everything he'd endured, he still hadn't learned how to allow himself weakness without feeling guilty. After that quiet but dangerous mental crossroads, when all the external roles started becoming too heavy to keep carrying, the only thing that kept Dwayne Johnson here in this world wasn't contracts, nor fame, nor professional duty, it was his children. In those children's eyes, he wasn't an icon, wasn't the strongest guy in the room, wasn't a box office star or a character who always knew what to say to a crowd. He was just Dad. And that very simplicity pierced through the shell he'd built over decades. His kids looked at him, not with expectations, but with instinctive trust, not with admiration, but with the need for presence. They didn't need him to win, didn't need him to be strong, didn't need him to be unbeatable. They needed him there, right on time, long enough, and real enough. For the first time in many years, Dwayne realized there was a space where he didn't have to prove anything, where tiredness wasn't seen as failure, where weakness didn't disappoint anyone. He began allowing himself to slow down in small moments, sitting on the floor to play with them, listening to innocent questions that didn't demand perfect answers, being present in evenings without lights or applause. In those moments, he felt clearly something he'd lacked throughout his childhood and most of his adult life: unconditional safety. His kids didn't care how much he'd achieved or lost. They cared whether he stayed. That very thing forced Dwayne to face an unavoidable truth. If he kept running from his own exhaustion through work and image, he would repeat the exact cycle that had once hurt him. This time, the fear no longer took the shape of poverty or career failure. It took the shape of becoming an absent father, a man who was always there formally but distant emotionally. That realization didn't come as a complete healing moment. It came as a quiet decision. He would no longer run. Dwayne allowed himself to be weak in front of his children, not through complaints, but through simple honesty that he was tired too, that he didn't always know what to do, that he was also learning to slow down. That didn't make him smaller in their eyes. On the contrary, it made him more real, closer, and that closeness was what he'd been searching for his whole life without naming it. Being with his kids, he understood that strength isn't always the ability to endure in silence. Sometimes it's the ability to stay when you want to leave, the ability to open up when instinct tells you to brace harder. Not perfect healing, not erasing old scars, but learning to live with them without letting them control every decision. His children became the only reason he stayed through the hardest days, not out of duty, but out of a love that didn't demand he become a different version. Dwayne began to understand that some roles can't be performed, they can only be lived, and being a father is one of them. It doesn't bring applause, has no rankings, no numbers to measure success, but it brings a kind of meaning he'd never had before, the meaning of being needed not for strength, but for presence. In his children's eyes, he didn't need to be unbeatable. He just needed to be the one who doesn't leave. And from that, a quiet but profound change began. Not a spectacular rebirth, not complete salvation, but the choice to stay in this life in a different way, where Dwayne Johnson no longer ran from himself, but learned to stand still long enough to be seen as a human being before being any other icon. At age 53, Dwayne Johnson no longer stands before the world as an unbeatable man, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he no longer feels the need to. The years of compression forced him to learn a hard-to-swallow lesson. Limits aren't the enemy. and acknowledging them doesn't make him smaller. His body is still strong, work is still heavy, fame is still there, but the way he sees everything has changed. He began accepting that fear won't disappear just because success grows bigger, that the insecurity from childhood, from losses and breakups, won't be erased by money or applause. Before, whenever fear rose up, he pushed it away with packed schedules, by being the strongest in the room, by never allowing himself to slow down. Now, he allows fear to exist without rushing to extinguish it, because he understands that trying to pretend he's not afraid was what eroded him the longest. At age 53, Dwayne Johnson no longer tries to prove anything to the world, no longer needs to be the loud version of strength to feel safe. He learned to say no to unnecessary rhythms of life, learned to choose presence over appearance, learned to be silent without feeling like he was disappearing. This change didn't happen through one big publicly announced decision. It happened in small, repeated choices every day, where he prioritized truth over image, endurance over explosion. He understood that no longer trying to appear strong doesn't mean becoming weak. It's shifting from performative strength to inner strength, the kind that doesn't need others' recognition to exist. There are mornings he still wakes up feeling heavy, still carrying the old questions about worth and enoughness. But unlike before, he doesn't panic over them. He knows who he is even when he's not on stage, not in the frame, not shouldering the pillar role for the whole room. At this age, he doesn't seek perfect healing. He seeks truth solid enough to live with the scars without being controlled by them. The limits he accepts aren't signs of retreat. They're necessary boundaries so he can keep standing long-term. He understands that running faster than every fear doesn't make them disappear. Only stopping, looking straight at them, and moving forward at his own pace keeps him from being swept away. Dwayne Johnson, at age 53, is no longer the man who has to brace to prove he's worthy. He's the man who's lived long enough to understand that worth doesn't come from never falling. It comes from knowing how to stand back up without betraying himself. No more flashy promises of invincibility, no more need to keep a perfect image under every gaze, just one person who clearly knows who he is, how far he can go, and where he needs to stop, so he doesn't lose what's most important. At age 53, he's not unbeatable. He's just still standing. And in that standing, there is a fresh calm, not loud, not showy, but solid enough to keep living without needing to run from himself anymore. When the story closes at age 53, Dwayne Johnson doesn't stand before us as someone saved, nor as an icon who's just completed a resurrection journey. No last-minute miracle appeared to erase the years of childhood vigilance. No blinding moment strong enough to turn fear into distant memory. No complete victory that seals every crack. What's left is a man who's gone through too many layers of endurance to believe in sweet promises that everything will be okay. He wasn't saved by fame, by money, by box office, or by applause, because those very things once became the pressure that forced him to keep bracing when he was already drained inside. He also wasn't saved by a fall, or accident big enough to make the world pause and empathize. His pain had no easy shape for others to see and step in. No resurrection, because resurrection implies an old version died for a new one to be born, while for Dwayne Johnson, every version stacks on top of the others, carrying memories of an insecure childhood, of a mother who once wanted to disappear, of a father who didn't know how to be present, of the quiet death of the NFL dream, of a dazzling but devouring The Rock, of billion-dollar success paired with the pressure of never being allowed to fall, of private breakdowns and unseen mental exhaustion. No complete victory, because complete victory demands a clear ending, a finish line where everything is settled, while his life is a chain of standing firm in non-stop flow, where each step is only about not being swept away rather than reaching a medal. Just one person who carried enough, carried the fear of losing everything from very early. carried the responsibility to be strong for others, carried the strongest in the room image, even when it eroded his inner life, carried the silence of pains that didn't fit under the lights. Just one person who didn't run, not from an unsafe childhood by denial, not from NFL failure by bitterness, not from booze by resentment, not from success by arrogance, not from exhaustion by dodging fatherhood, and just one person still standing not on an untouchable peak, but in the truth of himself, knowing his limits clearly, knowing fear won't vanish, knowing that stopping doesn't mean disappearing. That standing isn't loud, doesn't need honors, doesn't need more monuments. It's the result of choosing to stay when instinct wants to leave, choosing presence when habit wants to run, choosing truth when image is easier. If this story has one final meaning, it's not a promise that effort is always rewarded, nor a formula to turn suffering into success. The meaning lies elsewhere, quieter and more uncomfortable. Some people aren't saved because they don't wait for salvation. They learn to carry their pain with them without letting it control every decision. Dwayne Johnson doesn't need to be called a legend to close this journey. He just needs to be seen as a man who endured enough and still chose to stand. Some people don't need to be honored. They just need to be understood that they've endured enough. The story of Dwayne Johnson doesn't just leave a feeling of admiration. First and foremost, it leaves a deep, quiet, very real sadness. Sadness because behind the image of the man who always smiles, always strong in public, is a child who grew up in insecurity, always listening for every car outside the door in fear of losing home. Heartache because when the NFL dream collapsed, he came home with only $7 in his pocket. No career, no identity, no one to say you tried hard enough. Even more painful is the moment his mother, Atta Johnson, fell into severe depression and once tried to end her life right in front of her son, forcing Dwayne to grow up too soon, swearing he would never become a burden to anyone. That very vow followed him his whole life, making him brace through wrestling, accept mockery, accept hatred, then bury himself behind the rock to please the crowd. When billion-dollar success with Fast and Furious and Jumanji arrived, it didn't save him. It placed the pressure of not allowed to fall on his shoulders, so his career soared alongside a broken marriage and unseen mental exhaustion. The most honorable thing about Dwayne Johnson isn't in the box office or the muscles. It's in the moment he dared admit his limits, dared stay for his children, dared stop running from himself. For the American people, this story reminds us that the American dream isn't always a glorious victory. Often, it's just the ability to stand firm after silent losses. The lesson isn't that effort is always rewarded. It's that a person's worth lies in how much they've carried without giving up, and that sometimes the bravest thing isn't moving forward. It's daring to stop, to live true to yourself. If Dwayne Johnson's story has touched you, please subscribe to the channel to keep listening to Journeys Behind the Spotlight, where strength is measured by what a person has endured in silence. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue telling stories that have never been seen in full.